And we're back. Another movement prep vlog. And the reason I'm showing you guys what I'm doing for movement prep is because if we can start doing more stuff for ourselves away from training, when we get to the gym, we won't need to waste time in our warm-ups. We can just focus on priming ourselves to train. And then we're actually training, we're gonna feel better, we're gonna be able to move better, we're gonna be able to train more effectively just because shit isn't all clunky and hurting, and a little bit of motion away from training can go a very, very, very long ways. Tomorrow is going to be a max effort deadlift for me, so a lot of the stuff I'm doing here is going to be focused on deadlifting, so let's get into it. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull my pants up a bit so that my belly isn't hanging out when I go to do the second thing I'm going to do. But the second thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab onto the chin-up bar and do a bit of a dead hang. Just gonna kind of hang out here, try to relax, let myself drop as far below my hands as I can. I'm gonna rotate around a little bit, swing side to side, kind of get into the lats, get into the triceps, get in the biceps, just feel a nice stretch through all of that stuff. And the whole point around running a dead hang prior to a deadlift is that, like, when I'm deadlifting, I want my arms like as far away from me as possible, and hanging from a chin-up bar, like even though the arms are above the head, not down below us, hanging from the chin bar can be so good for helping us get space. And after I run the dead hang with a double overhand grip, I'm gonna grab onto the bar with my mixed grip. And again, just doing this is gonna help me get better set into my mixed grip. It's gonna help to make sure that I have the shoulder rotation necessary to make that mixed grip work. And just kind of hanging out here, doing some scat pull-ups, doing some rotations, spinning around, moving side to side, and just kind of getting comfy in this position. It can make a huge freaking difference in how long your arms can hang, which is super critical, especially if you're a stubby-armed little guy like myself. And on the theme of range of motion access, the next thing I'm going to do is a couch stretch down here on this bench. I'm just going to plant the ankle on the bench and try to shove my knee as far back as I can. And then I'm going to come up into a really, really, really gnarly quad and hip flexor stretch. I'm going to try to keep some tension in my abs so I'm not just like totally dumping into extension. I know there is going to be some extension happening, but that's not the end of the world here. And the whole idea behind what I'm doing, Charles Poliquin used to talk about how before you deadlift, run a couch stretch to inhibit the hip flexors so that the glutes can work better. And I do think that he's correct in application, which is part of why I'm doing this. I don't think that his whole logic behind hip flexor inhibition is entirely right, but the idea that I'm operating on is I don't necessarily want to inhibit the hip flexors because I want my hip flexors to be strong to help control the pelvis and help with arthrokinematics of the hip. But what I want to do is make sure that I have enough access to extension so that my glutes can actually work well. We need to be able to access hip extension so the glutes can actually contract as hard as they need to contract to drive a deadlift lockout. And if we're missing access to this end range extension, it's going to fuck up our pelvic position. It's going to fuck up our ability to actually use our glutes. So doing this can be very good to make sure that we have that access. Now, in terms of making sure that the hip flexors are strong at this end range position, a static stretch might not be your best option. And that's why the next thing I'm going to hop into is a front foot elevated split squat with some hip flexor intent. Now, when I'm saying hip flexor intent, what I mean is I'm going to be squeezing this back glute hard. I'm going to be trying to keep my abs on, and I'm going to lower myself into a hip flexor stretch. And then as I come up, I am going to be using the front leg, but I'm also going to be using the back leg and the hip flexor to pull myself back up to the top. And with this stretch in the bottom and that pull out of the bottom, not only are we accessing that hip extension length, but we're also going to be strengthening the hip flexor at that lengthened position so that when it comes time to lock out a deadlift, our hip flexors are going to be able to work together with our glutes, with our abs to control that pelvic position to drive home a strong lockout. Now, other neat things that are happening on this front leg is I'm trying to go forward into as much knee travel as I can handle, and I'm trying to get as much ankle travel as I can handle as well. You'll notice that my heel is up right now, and I'm not just like letting it come up willy-nilly. I'm letting it come up while trying to drive it down, and I'm also getting a really gnarly stretch of the ankle, which is going to help prime me to shove my knee over that deadlift bar to help me get in a better start position with my short arm lengths. And the last thing I'm going to do before I head upstairs is a single leg RDL. Reason why I'm doing these is I want to make sure I have enough hip internal rotation access to get to the deadlift bar in a good position, and I want to prime my hips to work well to drive hip extension. Key points for doing these is number one, I'm going to load them contralaterally, meaning that if I'm doing them on my left leg, I'm going to be holding the kettlebell or dumbbell in my right hand. Once I'm up at the top, I'm going to pick up my right foot. I'm going to make sure my right glute is squeezed. I'm going to make sure my left glute is squeezed. I'm going to make sure that my brace is on and everything's locked in. And then I'm going to think about using my hip flexor to pull myself into a hinge while guiding the kettlebell over top of the foot that's still on the ground. Now, the reason I want to go over top of the foot that's still on the ground is it's going to help pull me into hip internal rotation. It's going to help me feel a stretch through the lateral hip. Once I feel that stretch through the lateral hip, I'm just going to flex the glute, drive back up to the top. What I want to make sure that I'm not doing is like opening up like a hip airplane, because if we're opening up like an airplane, we're going to be loading less into the glutes and we're not going to be going into that hip internal rotation. So we want to make sure we're guiding that kettlebell or dumbbell over the foot, make sure we're feeling the lateral hip, and then squeeze up to the top. From the side, what it's going to look like is, again, going to be squeezing both glutes hard, going to be stacking brace, going to be trying to pull in with hip flexor and load into that lateral hip, letting the kettlebell drift over my foot, keeping that back glute squeezed, keeping that back hip fully extended. Once I feel that stretch in the lateral hip, I'm just going to come back up to the top, and we're going to get reps in just like that, making sure we're pulling into tension, squeezing up out of tension, pulling into tension, and squeezing up out of tension. Now, the big thing to remember with all of these is that we don't necessarily need to be working hard. We just need to be working hard enough to make sure that things are working, so that when we get to the gym, things are already working well, and we don't need to roll around on the floor for half an hour to be ready to start training. So guys, that is the exact prep work that I did tonight to get me ready for tomorrow's deadlift session. Now, these might not be the best movements for you to do. These might not always be the best movements for me to do. And what movement selection in prep work comes down to is realizing what you need work on and then selecting movements to help you work on that. It will be individual. You might need to work on some things that I don't. You might be able to get away with not doing some of the things that I am, but what it comes down to is whether or not the movements you are doing gets you the effect that you are looking for. And the same thing can be said for sets, for reps, for frequency. What I try to tell people to do is figure out how little they can do the things to get the effect that they want. And if you're not getting the effect that you want, you might need to then titrate up in sets, in reps, in frequency, so that you can get enough stimulus to drive you in the right direction. And once you're being driven in the right direction, you're accessing those positions easier, things are feeling better, things are moving better. Just accessing those positions in training should be enough to keep carrying you forward, and you'll be able to pull back on the frequency with your prep work. For myself, what I'm doing right now is I'll do a couple rounds of this stuff the day before a big training session or the morning before a big training session, just to make sure that I am good to go before I get to the gym. And if things are feeling good, I will do a lot less in terms of sets and reps. If things are feeling clunky and if things feel like they need more work, I'm just going to go until it feels like it's working well enough, and that's all I need to run for the day. So guys, thank you so much for watching. If this helped, drop a comment below or just hit like button. One of those two things. Maybe click subscribe if you're feeling really generous. Peace out. Have a good night.
That was awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
I am worried about the rest of it, but whatever, it'll work.
I bet that it's probably better than you think it is.
Yeah. Okay. I don't feel good.